Patricia Wong. In 2016, Hawaii County Police put a name out publicly in connection with a death in Puna. And what made that moment stand out was how long it had been sitting there. This wasn't something that had just happened. It wasn't a new case breaking in real time. It was about a young woman who had died back in 2009 and whose death had never really stopped being a question. Her name was Casey Smith. Casey was 21 years old when she was found dead inside a home in Orchid Land Estates in the Puna district of Hawaii Island. The date was June 30th, 2009, and she had been shot in the head. At the time, her death was treated as a suicide. For the people left behind, that explanation became the end of the story, whether it made sense to them or not. And just like that, years went by without trace or reason for what had happened. However, behind the scenes, the case never completely disappeared. Investigators kept circling back, not because they found something they could hold on to, but because the pieces around Casey's life didn't line up cleanly. As the investigation went on, the focus slowly moved away from her final moment, toward the people around her and the roles they played before she died. Investigators began asking a different set of questions. Not just where she was found, but who had been around her in the time leading up to her death, who she spoke to regularly, and who she had contact with. They went back through conversations, through accounts given years earlier, through statements that, on their own, didn't raise alarms but didn't quite sit right when placed next to each other either. Certain names appeared once, then again, then in places they didn't expect. One of those names belonged to Patricia Wong. She wasn't listed as a distant acquaintance. She wasn't someone investigators had to track down through chance encounters. Wong was already inside Casey's life. She spoke to her directly. She positioned herself as someone Casey could rely on, someone who carried authority. She referred to herself as Casey's Hanai auntie, not by blood, but by role. That mattered. Because when investigators began mapping Casey's final stretch of life, Wong wasn't on the edge of it. She was present. She was involved. She was close enough that her actions didn't look suspicious at first, just familiar. As police re-examined what had once been accepted, they started seeing the same pattern repeat. Decisions Casey didn't make alone, directions that didn't come from nowhere. Moments where influence mattered more than force. And when investigators pressed into those moments, the same figure kept appearing. By the time authorities were now revisiting the case publicly in 2016, they weren't chasing a theory anymore. They were narrowing in on responsibility. Hawaii County Police identified Patricia Wong, also known as Patricia Hanoa, as a person wanted in connection with Casey Smith's death. That step wasn't about reopening old grief. It was about acknowledging that what happened in 2009 had not been fully understood the first time, and from there, the picture widened again. Prosecutors would later allege that Casey's death wasn't just a killing, but one that was deliberately framed to look like something else. That the appearance of suicide was not a mistake, but part of the plan. And that Wong had not acted alone. Another name entered the investigation, a man named Peter Fuerte. According to the state, Patricia Wong and Peter worked together, not in a sudden eruption of violence, but through planning and coordination, through conversations that crossed into conspiracy, through attempts to involve others, actions prosecutors later charged as criminal solicitation. On February 27, 2024, inside Hilo Circuit Court, Patricia Wong was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole for second-degree murder, and life with the possibility of parole for attempted second-degree murder. On top of that, the court imposed a 20-year prison term for the conspiracy and solicitation convictions, ordering that sentence to be served consecutively. During the hearing, Casey's mother, Emma Chong, addressed the court. More than 14 years after her daughter's death, she spoke in a room where the truth was no longer in dispute. Today, Patricia Wong remains incarcerated. And while Casey Smith's story no longer ends with an assumption made in 2009, but with a verdict that took years to reach, something happened 9 years after her death something so ordinary that no one would have paid attention to it if it hadn't gone wrong. Darrell M. Freeman. Cars were moving through Aiea in the middle of the day, a stretch of road near a busy shopping area on Oahu. Drivers were moving as usual, and nothing about that moment suggested it would end in a homicide. Witnesses would later tell police that two vehicles became involved in an argument on the road. It was not a planned meeting, and was not a setup, just a confrontation that built while both drivers were still inside their cars. One of those vehicles was driven by 31-year-old Keenan Pahio. The other was a van driven by Darrell Freeman. At some point, the vehicles stopped. Freeman's van was positioned in front of Pahio's car. The argument continued, no longer just through windows or gestures. Pahio got out of his vehicle and approached the van. According to witness testimony presented at trial, he struck Freeman during the confrontation. What happened next went from 0 to 100 in seconds. Freeman brought out a gun and fired a single shot at Pahio, who collapsed to the ground. Prosecutors later said the shot was fired at point-blank range and struck Pahio in the head. There was no exchange of gunfire. It was only that one shot that was fired, but it didn't end there. Once Pahio fell flat, Freeman drove away from the scene. As he fled, he ran over Pahio's body fatally, an action prosecutors later argued showed intent. Pahio was transported to the hospital, where he later died from his injuries. What is heartbreaking was that two of his young daughters were inside his vehicle right there when everything happened. They saw their father shot and ran over in front of them. Police traced the van back to Freeman and arrested him at his home shortly afterward. While authorities investigated the whole thing, from the beginning, the central question of the case was not whether Freeman fired the gun, but why. At trial, Freeman's attorney told the jury that Freeman acted in self-defense and that Pahio was armed, claiming the gun discharged during a struggle between the two men. Prosecutors challenged that account, pointing to the physical evidence, witness testimony, and the sequence of events after the shooting, including Freeman fleeing the scene. The jury weighed those competing narratives. In October 2018, Freeman was convicted of second-degree murder and firearm offenses for the March 2017 killing of Keenan Pahio. The verdict rejected the self-defense claim and concluded that the shooting was not justified under the law. Sentencing came later, and it was definitive. On June 17, 2020, a judge sentenced Darrell Freeman to life in prison with the possibility of parole, with a mandatory minimum of 15 years before he can be considered for release. The sentence reflected both the severity of the crime and Hawaii's statutory framework for second-degree murder involving a firearm. As the case closed in court, more details surfaced in public reporting. Records showed Freeman had prior convictions from years earlier, including theft and firearm-related offenses. Reporting also noted that Pahio had his own prior criminal history and had been placed on probation shortly before his death. None of those details changed the outcome of the case, but they became part of how the story was discussed and debated afterward. What remained unchanged was the core sequence. A road rage confrontation, a punch, a single gunshot, and a man killed in public daylight while his children watched from the car. People showed concern, asking questions about why Freeman's parole possibility would be only after 15 years. And while those questions were asked, on the afternoon of May 12, 2022, Central Maui was dealing with dangerous conditions. Cristale Sharian Kaniakua. Strong winds were moving across dry fields near the isthmus, and firefighters were rushing from one brush fire call to another. None of the early dispatches suggested how closely connected those fires might be, or that one of them would soon shut down Maui Veterans Highway near Pu'unene, cutting traffic in both directions as smoke drifted across the road. The fire along Maui Veterans Highway burned roughly 5 acres before crews were able to contain it. Heavy equipment was brought in to cut control lines, and drivers were forced to wait while firefighters worked against wind that threatened to push the flames farther. At first, it looked like another dangerous but familiar Maui brush fire, serious and disruptive. However, it was handled once resources arrived. And while the firefighters worked the fire, a call came in to police from a civilian witness. The witness reported seeing someone deliberately setting a fire nearby. The call was immediate. The witness gave a description and information about a vehicle. That report immediately shifted the response from fire control to investigation. Police tracked the information provided by the witness to John Hollis, who investigators identified as being with Cristale Kaniakua earlier that afternoon. Surveillance footage would later show the two together inside a store purchasing items that later drew attention. They purchased a gas can, lighter fluid, charcoal, and Lysol, all before the fire was reported. Officers located and arrested him as they began reconstructing the sequence of events leading up to the fire. As the investigation widened, police linked the Maui Veterans Highway fire to a cluster of suspicious brush fires reported across central Maui that same afternoon. During that process, officers were also searching for Stephen Sarol, identified as Cristale Kaniakua's boyfriend. Sarol was taken into custody during the same period, but on separate matters involving contempt of court and alleged bail violations. He was not charged or convicted of arson in connection with the Maui Veterans Highway brush fire, a distinction that remained clear all through the case. The case against Cristale Kaniakua and John Hollis unfolded slowly through the court system. John ultimately pleaded guilty to second-degree arson, and as part of that plea, he agreed to cooperate with prosecutors and testify. In exchange, the court imposed a shorter sentence of 1 year in jail, followed by probation, reflecting his cooperation in the case against Cristale Kaniakua. Cristale, on the other hand, chose to go to trial. Prosecutors argued that the fire was intentionally set and that it occurred while police were actively searching for Sarol, framing the blaze as a deliberate act that created extreme risk in a known wildfire-prone area. The defense challenged the state's version of events, but the jury was asked to decide whether the evidence showed intentional arson beyond a reasonable doubt. On June 3, 2024, the jury returned its verdict. Cristale was found guilty of second-degree arson for intentionally setting the central Maui brush fire along Maui Veterans Highway. Sentencing came later, in August 2024, in Second Circuit Court in Wailuku. Judge Peter Cahill imposed the maximum penalty allowed for the offense, sentencing her to 10 years in prison. From the bench, he addressed the broader danger posed by intentionally setting fires in windy, dry conditions, referencing the scale of destruction that wildfire can cause in Hawaii when conditions align. The after-effects of the case extended beyond the courtroom. The fire had shut down a major roadway, forced emergency crews into rapid response, and added to a series of suspicious fires that unsettled central Maui that afternoon. Even though the blaze was contained that same afternoon, the risk it posed was real, and the response it demanded was costly. Please remember to show support for my effort in making this interesting video by liking the video and commenting what you think about these cases. Thank you. Byron Koji Uesugi. The story of Byron Uesugi did not begin like every other case or happen all of a sudden. It began years earlier, inside an ordinary workplace in Honolulu, where he worked as a Xerox service technician. By the mid-1980s, Uesugi had become a familiar presence at the company. He showed up, did his job, and moved through the same routines as everyone else. But over time, that routine became strained. Co-workers later described persistent conflict, difficulty working with him, and behavior that caused concern long before violence ever entered the picture. Years earlier, he had been involved in a workplace incident that led to a psychiatric evaluation and anger management counseling. At the time, it was treated as an internal matter. No one knew then how significant that moment would later seem. By the fall of 1999, the tension had not disappeared. On the morning of November 2nd, Uesugi arrived at the Xerox facility on North Nimitz Highway during normal business hours. It was a workday like any other, and employees were inside the building, settling into tasks. What happened next unfolded quickly and with devastating finality. Uesugi opened fire inside the workplace, killing 7 men in the building that morning. The victims were 33-year-old Jason Balatico, 41-year-old Ford Kanehira, 50-year-old Ronald Kataoka, 54-year-old Ronald Kawame, 58-year-old Melvin Lee, 46-year-old Peter Mark, and 36-year-old John Sakamoto. An 8th co-worker was shot at but survived and managed to escape with his life. The violence ended as suddenly as it began, leaving behind a workplace turned into a crime scene and families facing irreversible loss. The attack became the deadliest mass shooting in Hawaii's history. Uesugi fled the scene in a Xerox company van, triggering a citywide search. Hours later, police located him near the Hawaii Nature Center in Makiki, overlooking downtown Honolulu. What followed was a prolonged standoff that held the city in suspense. Officers secured the area and negotiators worked to communicate with him. The situation carried an added layer of urgency because children were present at the nearby nature center at the time. For hours, the standoff continued without resolution, raising the possibility of further violence. Eventually, in the mid-afternoon, Uesugi surrendered to police without additional bloodshed. He came out by himself, posing no further threat and raising no alarm. He was taken into custody, and the immediate crisis ended, though the consequences were only beginning. As the case moved into the courtroom, the focus shifted from what happened to why it happened. Prosecutors charged Uesugi with first-degree murder and attempted murder. The defense centered on his mental state, arguing that he was not legally responsible for his actions due to mental illness. The trial forced jurors to weigh expert testimony, workplace history, and the events of that morning against Hawaii's legal standards for criminal responsibility. On June 13, 2000, the jury rejected the insanity defense. Uesugi was found guilty of first-degree murder and attempted second-degree murder, affirming that he was legally accountable for the killings. Sentencing followed, 2 months later. Circuit Judge Marie Milks imposed the most severe punishment available under Hawaii law. For first-degree murder, Uesugi received a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For the attempted murder of the surviving co-worker, he was sentenced to an additional life term with the possibility of parole. The sentences were ordered to run consecutively. Hawaii does not have the death penalty, and life without parole is reserved for only the most extreme crimes. Later, the Hawaii Paroling Authority set a minimum term of 235 years, a number that ensured Uesugi would never be released. The case, however, did not end there. Uesugi appealed his conviction, challenging aspects of the trial, including jury instructions related to mental responsibility. The case reached the Hawaii Supreme Court, which reviewed the arguments and upheld the convictions. The verdicts and sentences remained intact, closing the door on further relief through the courts. Hawaii houses some of its longest-serving inmates on the mainland, and today Uesugi remains confined at Saguaro Correctional Center in Eloy, Arizona, a private prison that holds Hawaii inmates under an out-of-state contract. It is a permanent confinement, far from the islands where the crime occurred and where its impact is still felt. 10 years later, by 2010, Hawaii was still sending hundreds of its inmates to that same Arizona prison, and what happened there in February of that year would expose how quickly a Hawaii sentence could turn into an Arizona murder case, which brings us to the next case. Miti Maugautega Jr. The man who would not survive that day was Bronson Nunuha, a 26-year-old Hawaii inmate serving his sentence thousands of miles from home. He had been transferred to Saguaro under Hawaii's mainland prison contract, like many others. Unfortunately, he was not facing decades ahead of him. He was nearing the end of his Hawaii sentence, with just a few months left before his release. Another Hawaii inmate housed at Saguaro was Miti Maugautega Jr. His presence in Arizona was the result of earlier convictions in Hawaii. Court records and media reporting described a violent criminal history that included multiple felony cases, among them home invasion and sexual assault. Those convictions had already placed him on a long path through the prison system, with parole eligibility projected far into the future. By the time he arrived at Saguaro, he was not a short-term inmate. He was someone the system expected to hold for decades. On February 18th, Bronson Nunuha was attacked inside his cell. He was stabbed repeatedly and had more than 100 stab wounds, an amount later used by prosecutors to establish intent and brutality rather than a sudden fight. Investigators also reported that markings associated with prison gang symbolism had been carved into his body, which made authorities treat the killing not as an argument gone wrong, but as a deliberate act tied to internal prison enforcement. Investigators identified Miti Maugotega as one of the participants, along with another Hawaii inmate, Micah Kanahele. Kanahele's case was resolved first. He pleaded guilty in Arizona to first-degree murder and was sentenced to natural life in prison, meaning life without the possibility of release. That plea anchored the state's theory of the case and confirmed that Arizona would pursue full homicide charges, even though everyone involved had been sentenced originally in Hawaii. Miti Maugautega's case moved more slowly. Arizona charged him with first-degree murder, asserting that the killing of Bronson Nunuha was intentional, planned, and carried out with extreme violence. The prosecution's decision carried major consequences. Because the murder occurred in Arizona, the case fell entirely under Arizona law. That meant sentencing options that did not exist in Hawaii, including the death penalty. In December 2022, after trial proceedings in Pinal County Superior Court, an Arizona jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, triggering Arizona's capital sentencing process. Jurors were asked to weigh aggravating factors against mitigation. The process stalled when a jury could not reach a unanimous decision on whether he should be sentenced to death. The case paused again, this time in uncertainty. The conviction stood, but the punishment was unresolved. Then, in September 2023, Arizona prosecutors formally withdrew their notice of intent to seek the death penalty. With that decision, the case moved to final sentencing, and Judge Robert Olson sentenced Maugauotega to natural life in prison for the murder of Bronson Nunuha. The sentence came with a crucial condition: that the life sentence would begin only after he completed his existing Hawaii prison sentences. In effect, two systems acknowledged each other's authority. Hawaii would hold him first. Arizona would hold him forever after that. Advocacy groups and civil litigation cited his case as an example of the risks created when incarcerated people are housed far from home, under different supervision, in facilities where prison politics can escalate quickly and violently. Kaleanuanu Borero Kaluna. Whittington Beach Park sits along Hawaii Island's Kau coast, a public shoreline where people usually go to slow down, grill food, and watch the water. On the night of the 26th of April 2019, that familiar setting became the focus of a fatal criminal investigation. That Friday evening, Hawaii police responded to reports of a stabbing at the park. When officers arrived, they found two people suffering from stab wounds. One was 35 years old, Marie Lynn Boyles, and the other was a 36-year-old man, later described in reports as Boyles' boyfriend. Both were rushed to Hilo Medical Center. Boyles was pronounced dead at the hospital, but the male victim survived his injuries. In the days that followed, investigators worked to reconstruct what had happened at the park. As they pieced together statements and evidence, attention narrowed to a 19-year-old woman from Naalehu. She was Kaleanuenue Borero Kaluna. Police also identified Robert Hayes, a 69-year-old man from the same community, as a second suspect. Hayes was later released while the investigation continued. Borero Kaluna was arrested and held in custody. As the case moved into court, prosecutors alleged that Borero Kaluna stabbed Marie Lynn Boyles during the encounter at Whittington Beach Park. Court filings also confirmed that the surviving male victim had been injured during the same incident. The charges reflected the seriousness of what investigators believed had occurred, and Borrero Kaluna remained incarcerated at the Hawaii Community Correctional Center as the case progressed. By September 2019, the direction of the case shifted. Borrero Kaluna changed her plea and entered a no-contest plea to manslaughter in connection with Boyle's death. As part of the plea agreement, prosecutors dismissed attempted first-degree murder and attempted second-degree murder charges. The plea was entered on the basis of extreme mental or emotional disturbance, a legal standard acknowledged during the court proceedings. The plea did not change the core facts of the case, which was that Marie Lynn Boyles died from the stab wounds sustained at Whittington Beach Park on April 26, 2019. And her boyfriend was also stabbed but survived. Law enforcement identified Borrero Kaluna as the person responsible for the fatal stabbing. Court-related reporting also confirmed that Borrero Kaluna was 8 months pregnant at the time of the incident. After the plea, the case did not end immediately. Borrero Kaluna remained in custody while the court prepared for sentencing. On December 6, 2019, a judge sentenced her to 8 years in prison for manslaughter. The sentence brought the legal process to a close without a trial, resolving the case through a conviction rather than a jury verdict. Malia Elena Arciero. Drug trafficking in the United States rarely looks the way people imagine it. It doesn't always begin with border crossings, dramatic chases, or large-scale raids. More often, it moves quietly through ordinary places, cars on familiar roads, short meetings, routine exchanges that don't draw attention. And what gives federal cases their weight is repetition, patterns, quantities that cross legal thresholds, and decisions that once made can't be walked back. In Hawaii, where federal drug prosecutions carry some of the strictest penalties in the country, investigators don't need chaos to step in. They need timelines that hold together. They need amounts that trigger mandatory minimums, and they need proof that what's happening isn't accidental or isolated, but intentional and ongoing. That's the framework this case falls into. By April of 2013, federal agents had already narrowed their focus to a Honolulu woman named Malia Elena Arciero. What brought her onto their radar wasn't a single moment, but a short span of time where actions began to line up, small distributions followed by larger ones, movements that suggested preparation rather than impulse. And to investigators, it looked like a sequence building towards something bigger. Earlier that month, on April 20, 2013, Arciero distributed a sample amount of methamphetamine. On its own, the quantity was limited. But federal prosecutors later described it as part of a broader distribution effort, not a one-off exchange. 4 days later, on April 24th, she was involved in the distribution of approximately 2 ounces of methamphetamine. That supply did not stay with her. It was later sold by another individual, extending the reach of the drugs beyond the initial transaction. By that point, investigators were no longer looking at isolated events. They were watching a pattern take shape. The momentum went up into the final days of the month. On April 30, 2013, Arciero was arrested while driving with methamphetamine in her vehicle. According to federal authorities, the amount was substantial, approximately 1 pound. At the time of her arrest, investigators stated that she was en route to deliver the drugs to an individual who was cooperating with law enforcement. The delivery never happened. The arrest stopped it before it could be completed. What followed mattered just as much as what led up to that moment. After being taken into custody, Arciero admitted to transporting the methamphetamine. Federal prosecutors also stated that she acknowledged previously distributing multi-pound quantities of the drug. That admission expanded the scope of the case. The investigation was no longer limited to what had been seized that day. It now included statements tying her to larger volumes, moving through the same channels. The case advanced into the United States District Court for the District of Hawaii, where the focus shifted from surveillance and arrests to proof and procedure. By the time the matter reached trial, the central question was no longer whether methamphetamine had been present. but whether the government could establish that Arciero had knowingly and intentionally distributed it as part of a conspiracy. The trial lasted 6 days. Jurors heard evidence related to the April distributions, the April 30th arrest, and the structure prosecutors said connected those events. On January 8, 2015, the jury returned its verdict. Malia Elena Arciero was found guilty of 4 federal drug offenses. The convictions included 1 count of conspiracy to distribute and possess with intent to distribute 50 grams or more of methamphetamine, 2 counts of distribution and possession with intent to distribute 50 grams or more of methamphetamine, and 1 count of distribution of some quantity of methamphetamine. With the verdict entered, the case moved into its final phase. Sentencing in federal court is not limited to the facts proven at trial. The court also considers conduct that occurs during the proceedings themselves. In Arciero's case, that conduct became a point of contention. Before sentencing, the presiding judge addressed accusations Arciero had made against the lead federal investigator assigned to her case. The court determined that the accusations were false and constituted obstruction of justice. The judge found that they were made in an effort to influence the judicial process. On the eve of sentencing, Arciero submitted a sworn declaration acknowledging that the accusations against the investigator were unsubstantiated and without factual basis. She also dismissed a related civil lawsuit she had filed against the agent. By then, the issue had already been weighed by the court. Sentencing took place on September 21, 2015. Chief United States District Judge Susan Oki Mulway imposed a sentence of 172 months in federal prison for the 4 methamphetamine distribution convictions. The sentence was followed by a 5-year term of supervised release, along with the mandatory special assessment required under federal law. At sentencing, the court noted that the statutory penalties for the offenses included a mandatory minimum term of imprisonment and the possibility of life imprisonment on the most serious counts. The judgment closed the trial court proceedings, but not the legal record. Arciero later sought appellate review of her conviction and sentence. The United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit reviewed the case and affirmed the district court's judgment. The convictions remained in place. The 172-month sentence stood. When the case is viewed in full, the outcome traces back to a narrow window in April 2013, a sequence of distributions, an arrest during an attempted delivery, admissions made afterward, and a sentence shaped not only by the quantity of drugs involved, but by how the court determined the process unfolded once the case entered the federal system. 14 years and 4 months became the final measure of a case that moved steadily and decisively once the pattern was established. Nainoa Damon. In the early morning hours of March 18, 2022, several people gathered at a scenic lookout along Round Top Drive on Tantalus in Honolulu. It was a place known for city views and late-night conversations, and nothing initially suggested that the gathering would turn violent. At some point during those early hours, a masked individual approached the group. Police later said the individual pointed a gun at one person's head and demanded property. While that confrontation was unfolding, a second person in the group revealed that he was also armed. That person was 18-year-old Haheo Colonna. Investigators stated that Colonna pointed his firearm at the masked suspect. Moments later, the suspect fired his weapon. Colonna was struck by the gunfire. He was placed into a private vehicle and rushed to a hospital, where he later died from his injuries. The suspect left the lookout immediately after the shooting. Police said he fled the area in a white 1998 Toyota Camry with a front seat passenger and traveled toward Nahoa Street. As the investigation moved forward, police identified the shooter as Nainoa Damon, who was 19 years old at the time. According to Crime Stoppers Honolulu, Damon turned himself in at the Wahiawa police station the next day, March 19, 2022, at approximately 10 minutes past 2 p.m. During the trial, Hawaii Public Radio reported that Damon's defense attorney told jurors that he turned himself in after being urged to do so by his mother for his own safety. Hawaii News Now later reported that Damon's mother was Honolulu Police Sergeant Jennifer Bugarin and that his stepfather was also a Honolulu police officer. The outlet also reported that Damon did not live with his mother at the time of the shooting. In May 2024, an Oahu Circuit Court jury found Damon guilty in connection with the fatal shooting at the Tantalus Lookout and convicted him of second-degree murder, first-degree robbery, first-degree terroristic threatening, and 3 weapons-related offenses. They also found him guilty of robbery, terroristic threatening, and firearms offenses, in addition to the murder conviction. On August 22, 2024, in Oahu Circuit Court, Judge Shanlin Park sentenced Damon to life in prison with the possibility of parole and ordered that he serve a minimum of 15 years before becoming eligible for parole. The judge denied the prosecution's request for extended sentencing. During the sentencing hearing, members of Haheo Kolona's family addressed the court. Hawaii News Now reported that Kolona's mother described her son as her heart, her rock, and her best friend. The outlet also reported that Kolona's father, Blake Kolona, brought his son's ashes into the courtroom and asked that Damon look at them. Damon became emotional during the hearing after his grandmother spoke on his behalf. In explaining the sentence, the judge referenced Damon's upbringing and his role as a caregiver for his grandfather. After the sentencing concluded, Hawaii News Now reported that Blake Kolona stated he believed Damon received a lighter sentence because of Damon's family connections to law enforcement. The outlet also reported that emotions escalated outside the courtroom, where Kolona's father expressed anger while holding his son's ashes as deputies intervened. Ashley Rose Nihipali and Kuipo Lainala Nihipali. On October 31, 2018, Hawaii police responded to the Kailua fire station in Kailua Kona after a 6-year-old boy was brought there unconscious by a family member. The child, later identified as Mazan Kaniela Nihipali Monis, was transported to Kona Community Hospital, where he was pronounced dead later that afternoon. Police stated that the injuries observed were not consistent with an accident, prompting a homicide investigation. Investigators traced the events leading up to Mazan's death to a residence on Manawalia Street in Kona. Ashley Rose Nihipali, identified in court records and reporting as Mazan's mother or primary guardian, lived at the home with her wife, Kuipo Lainala Nihipali. Law enforcement determined that both women had been responsible for Mazan's care in the period leading up to his death. In August 2019, a Hawaii Island grand jury indicted Ashley Nihipali and Kuipo Nihipali in connection with the child's death. Prosecutors alleged that Mazan had been subjected to repeated abuse over an extended period of time and that the fatal injuries were the result of that abuse. Authorities stated that the case involved more than a single incident and pointed to a pattern of violence inside the home. Court proceedings revealed testimony and evidence describing repeated acts of physical abuse, including choking, and allegations that other children in the household had been threatened to prevent them from speaking about what they witnessed. Prosecutors argued that the abuse escalated over time and ultimately resulted in Mazan's death on Halloween 2018. In September 2020, Ashley Nihipali entered a guilty plea to manslaughter and multiple counts of felony abuse of a family or household member. As part of the plea agreement, other charges, including second-degree murder, were dismissed. During sentencing proceedings, prosecutors characterized the abuse as severe and prolonged, and the court described the conduct as torturous. On December 11, 2020, Kona Circuit Court Judge Robert Kim sentenced Ashley Nihipali to a maximum term of 25 years in prison. The sentence consisted of 20 years for manslaughter, followed by a consecutive 5-year term related to the felony abuse convictions. Kuipo Nihipali resolved her case separately through a plea agreement. In February 2021, she was sentenced to 5 years of probation after pleading guilty to charges that included child abuse and hindering prosecution. As part of the plea deal, more serious charges were dropped. Court records and reporting noted that she had already spent a significant period in custody before her sentencing. An autopsy later confirmed Mazen Kanyela Nihipali Moniz's manner of death as homicide. Prosecutors stated that the investigation relied on medical findings, witness statements, and disclosures from children in the household, which collectively contradicted claims that the child's injuries were accidental. The case drew public attention because of the severity of the abuse, the young age of the victim, and the disparity between the sentences imposed on the two defendants. Authorities emphasized that the investigation unfolded over time as evidence was gathered and witness accounts emerged, ultimately leading to the convictions and sentences imposed by the court. Anthony F. Pereira II. On June 10, 2016, police were dispatched to a residence in Maui on Oahu's leeward coast following reports of a domestic disturbance. When officers entered the home, they found 66-year-old Barbara Pereira deceased from multiple gunshot wounds. The suspect was identified as her son, Anthony Pereira II, who at the time was a correction officer assigned to the Oahu Community Correctional Center. Anthony Pereira had worked at the Oahu Community Correctional Center for the past 14 years after being hired in 2002. At the time of the incident, he was on leave without pay. What happened that day was not a sudden, isolated act, but a sequence of events that prosecutors later laid out in detail. Evidence showed that before Barbara Pereira was killed, she was held against her will inside her own home. Another woman, Dodi Guzman, was also inside the residence during that confrontation. She was threatened with a firearm and prevented from leaving, but she eventually managed to escape the house when Anthony got distracted and alerted authorities. That escape changed the trajectory of the situation. When police arrived, they encountered Anthony still inside the home, armed. Barbara Pereira was already dead when they arrived, and her body was found at the scene. The house became a crime scene, and Pereira was taken into custody as investigators began piecing together what had happened inside those walls. Prosecutors charged him with second-degree murder for the killing of his mother. The charges did not stop there. The state also brought counts related to kidnapping conduct, first-degree terroristic threatening involving Dodi Guzman, firearm offenses connected to the alleged felonies, and promoting a dangerous drug in the third degree after methamphetamine was discovered there. The case was framed not as a single moment of violence, but as a chain of control, threats, and escalating behavior that ended in homicide. At trial, the defense did not deny that Barbara Pereira was killed by her son. Instead, it argued that Anthony Pereira was under extreme mental or emotional disturbance at the time of the shooting. His attorney claimed he believed his mother had killed his daughter and that this belief, combined with severe personal and marital stress, drove his actions. The court examined that claim closely. After reviewing the evidence and testimony, the judge rejected the defense, finding that the legal threshold for extreme mental or emotional disturbance had not been met. In June 2024, after a jury-waived trial, the court found Anthony Pereira guilty of second-degree murder, first-degree terroristic threatening, firearm offenses, and promoting a dangerous drug in the third degree. The kidnapping-related counts were merged for sentencing purposes, but the underlying conduct remained part of the court's findings. Sentencing followed in October 2024. The judge imposed a life sentence with the possibility of parole for the murder conviction, 20 years for the firearm offense, and 5 years each for the terroristic, threatening, and drug convictions, all ordered to run concurrently. The life sentence became the defining outcome of the case. Anthony Pereira appealed, arguing that the trial court had wrongly rejected the extreme mental or emotional disturbance defense. In December 2025, the Intermediate Court of Appeals of the State of Hawaii affirmed the convictions and the sentence. The appellate court found no reversible error and upheld the trial court's conclusions, locking the verdict in place. After sentencing, the Hawaii Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation reported that Pereira was housed at Halawa Correctional Facility. In June 2025, his incarceration there was publicly confirmed when a fight involving inmates led to a housing unit lockdown, and Pereira was identified as one of those involved. A man trained to manage inmates, enforce rules, and maintain control inside a correctional facility ended up convicted of killing his own mother inside a family home. If you enjoyed this and want to see more interesting videos, I'm going to be posting every day on this channel. I would really appreciate it if you like and subscribe. Thank you very much.